To start this crayfish pattern, I use a 2/0 OSHA Hennessy laser claw hook here with some 210 denier thread. This next part is optional how you do your weight. You can use dumbbell eyes, which I've done in the past, or you can use some lead. I've got 025 lead wire today. I make a bit of a pyramid type placement on the top part of the hook shank here, and this will allow that hook point to swim hook point up rather than swimming down. Kind of keels that hook just how you need it for a crayfish. And then I like to take the lead wraps into the bend of the hook. This should help it imitate fleeing with that tail up as it's going away from other fish. Next, I take some pheasant tail. I grab about 10-15 fibers, strip them from the stem. These fibers, when you put them in, they don't have to be even necessarily, but relatively same length. I like to start with my thread towards the bend of the hook here. That way I can easily adjust and kind of know how much I'm getting out the end there. So I want it to protrude a little bit past the end of the hook there. Not too far, maybe a quarter of a hook shank length off the bend. And then trap those down nicely right there on the end of that wire. Sorry, not wire, but that lead wire. At this point, it's time to flip the hook over and tie in your first claw. Here, I'm using a piece of mallard feather. I see lots of people use different feathers for this. I like the look of these with the speckled. You want this claw to protrude just a little bit further than the end of the hook here. Try and keep it even with that pheasant tail we put, but maybe a little further out. And then flip that over and you just repeat the same process here. You want that feather to bend outward. You don't want them facing inward, covering up that pheasant tail. Once you get the feathers about even, take some wraps rearward, really lock them in, and then you'll come in and you'll snip off the excess butts. So next is the eyes. I make mine out of 50-pound monofilament, color it black, and then color the stem orange. And here I crimp it with a pair of pliers, or these are needle drivers for healthcare. And this allows you to kind of get a better grip and allow you to place it how you want on there. Otherwise that mono just likes to spin around. But I like to get these eyes in there and get them protruding just past the pheasant tail. Take some wraps in there to lock it in, and you can kind of balance it on the edge of that feather that you just tied in for the claw. And then for the other side, you just want to do the same thing, lock it in, try and keep them about even. I like to keep the bend of that monofilament going upward so that the eyes are a little bit more prominent. And then after you cut this excess end, you can just really kind of hammer down on there. You can put some super glue on there, that's optional if you really want to make sure that it's not going to go anywhere. With the monofilament, you can always adjust at the end if you need to move them around a little bit. I like to take an extra wrap around them on the other side. That helps kind of flare them out. And then at the end, I'll adjust them. That way they're not sitting on the outside of the claw. Next is building our body. So I'm using some orange crayfish dubbing here. I start out with a good sized clump, a nice ball. That way I can kind of get it beefy, imagining it's the thicker part of the crayfish, that thorax portion of it. And then after I get that tied in, I'll take in some silly legs. I like to lay this across at an angle. That way it kind of splays one direction. And then give a little counterclockwise. Keep that thread from jumping forward and have it jump backwards to lock that down. One easy way I've found to get the other side tied in is to make this loop here and trap it in. That way it's also going in the same direction, and then you can also pull on this loop to adjust the length of that, which can always be cut at the end. But here I like to kind of get a finer adjustment to keep it even and then lock down on that loop before cutting it. Now we'll add some more dubbing to cover up the silly leg stump that we left in there. You don't have to worry about being stingy here since this is that thorax portion of the crayfish. So we'll put in another good sized clump of dubbing here, cover all those imperfections up, and then we'll tie in our next set of legs. For the first set of legs, I like to keep them out, no bend or anything, that way they kind of look like feelers. And then I pre-knot these, that way they face downward. They kind of look a little more natural, like the bend in a crawfish leg. I tie this in and get it how I want. Sometimes it takes a little playing with just to get them to face downward. Sometimes they want to stick up. And this is kind of where that loop comes into play again. I can pull out this side here, get that leg to bend downward a little more naturally, and then line up the other side and pull out the slack. And this loop helps a little bit more than the first tie-in because you can adjust the bend of that joint of that leg for the crayfish. The same as before, snip that loop out and then cover up some spots here with some more dubbing. This is where I'll start to use a little bit less dubbing than I did before. That's just to taper that body down as we get towards that hook eye. Alright, so I've got my dubbing in place. Now I'm going to go in with my last set of legs. This one is also bent as well. Same as before, tie it in, try and get that leg to point down, and then make your loop. Adjust the length of the bend on that crayfish leg, and then snip out your loop and proceed to cover up that spot with dubbing. For this last bit of dubbing, I like to wrap it until we meet that thread bump from our initial lead wire tie-in. Go ahead and load up a noodle of dubbing on your thread here and let it sit, because next we're going to create the tail of the crayfish. For this portion, we'll use some more pheasant tail, about 10 fibers, a clump like you used before, but this time we're going to try and make sure that those tips just go past that hook eye and curve upward a little bit. It can be a little tricky as you wrap this dubbing ball over, but you can move them around, maneuver them upwards, that way they kind of stick up. I tie that dubbing ball in to cover up that tie-in point, and then come in and snip real close, as close as you can, to get rid of that pheasant tail. Follow up with a couple wraps, and then take your whip finish tool and tie off your thread, lock in everything in place here, and then after we snip this thread, we'll go in for some cleanup. This is where you go in and you make your cuts below those knuckles or bends and the little legs on the crayfish. I like to keep the legs shorter and these first silly legs as the antennae a little bit longer. Next, I take a wire brush, Velcro on a stick, whatever you want to use, toothbrush, and brush it out, give it a nice buggy crayfish look. I like to brush it and then try and brush the fibers down. You can clean up those fibers on the top afterwards. It's personal preference. I like to cut this bottom portion of these little dubbing legs to be about half the length of my silly legs. Just be careful not to cut your silly legs when you're cutting these lower portions, and then clean some fibers up here on top. And then you can manipulate these eyes at the end, that way they stick out inside the claws rather than on the outside, and you've got a nice buggy crayfish pattern. Swims great, looks great. Thanks for watching. Tight line.